Hey, modern world history students. So far in the Cold War, you've learned about the policy of containment, in which the United States was determined to prevent governments that were free governments from falling to communism. So, for example, you saw how when Greece was threatened by a communist uprising, the United States provided aid and support to the Greek government that allowed them to defeat that sort of communist rebellion, and it kept Greece as a free country. We saw how when West Berlin was blockaded by the Soviets, we used an airlift to supply West Berlin so that West Berlin would not fall to communism. We created the NATO alliance to ensure that Western Europe would remain free and not be endangered by a communist invasion. So we had this policy of containment. The Soviets, it turns out, were equally determined to prevent communist governments in Eastern Europe from falling and becoming non-communist. So they in a sense had their own version of containment, and the actions that the Soviets took also exposed some of the weaknesses of our own approach to containment. So that's what this lesson is about. Two examples of countries in Eastern Europe that, in one way or other, attempted to break a little bit away from communism and what happened to them because they tried to do that. So we're on page 12, and the first example I'm going to give to you is Hungary. So, you think about the countries in Eastern Europe that were communist countries, taken over by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, with Soviet dictators, communist dictators installed there. We're talking about Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Hungary was one of those. And Hungary was one of the first to really come closest to splitting off from communism. So, the countries that had gone communist during that ending period of World War II, that were dominated and ruled by communist dictators, dominated by the Soviet Union, they used all the typical techniques of totalitarian governments to stay in power. They used, there was no freedom of speech or the press, so there was censorship. They had secret police who were trying to root out people who were sort of reformers or people who wanted to promote change and bring an end to communism. People were arrested, people were imprisoned, in some cases executed. So that was the kind of environment that you could expect in one of the communist countries of Eastern Europe during the Cold War. This is how they kept you in line. And this is also part of how the Soviets ensured that those countries would not go non communist. And sometimes, when necessary, the Soviets used armed force. So in 1956, there had been in the capital of Hungary, so the capital of Hungary is called Budapest, Budapest. Budapest is the capital of Hungary. There had been pretty significant uprisings by the population against the communist government there. These uprisings started with younger people, just kids a little older than you, university students and their professors, and it spread to the more general population. What were they demanding? Oh, they were demanding a more liberal government. They were demanding freedom of speech, demanding freedom of the press, and they were demanding that the Soviet Union finally live up to the promises that Joseph Stalin had made at Yalta, which was to allow free elections there, a democratically elected government. And initially, these protests were met by the Communist Party of Hungary with a certain amount of accommodation. So the Communist Party of Hungary realized, okay, we are failing to maintain the support and loyalty of our people. And there were certain communists in Eastern Europe who said, we need to make sure that communism has more of a human face, that so far, people have seen communism primarily, people in Eastern Europe have seen communism primarily as a way to oppress them, to control them. And if communism is not seen as a way to give people a better life, then they're never going to support it. And we're constantly going to have to arrest people and imprison people. And that's not the way it should be. There were some communists who said, if if people don't choose communism, then there's no righteousness in having communism, right? We've got to reform communism. We've got to change communism so that it will be something that people want, not something that we have to force on them. Because if we have to force it on them, then it's no good. And one of those people was Imre Nagy. So he was actually part of Hungary's Communist Party. He was a communist, but he regarded communism as it was functioning in Hungary as being sort of dysfunctional. It wasn't working right because the people didn't want it, the people didn't choose it. And so he was one of those, what we would call a reformer, a person who wanted to change communism the way it was practiced in Hungary so that it would be more humane and that it would therefore have more natural support from the people. You wouldn't have to force it down their throats. And so he took over leadership in all these protests that were going on. Imre Nagy took over leadership of Hungary's Communist Party. He became the leader of Hungary, and he began to institute some of these changes that people were demanding: freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And the Soviets tolerated it, which was very surprising because there had never been any indication that the Soviets would necessarily tolerate this kind of thing. Um, but the Soviets did tolerate it for the moment because they realized that by now Joseph Stalin was dead. Okay, Joseph Stalin died in 1953. This is now 1956, and the Soviet leaders who'd taken over after Stalin began to recognize that the same kind of thing that Imre Nagy did, which is that if people don't have a sort of a better attitude toward communism, if they don't like communism, if they don't choose communism, well, you're going to have to be snuffing out these protests all over Europe. So the Soviets sort of allowed Imre Nagy and the Hungarians to get away with some of these reforms, almost like a sort of an experiment, because they realized that if they could make communism more satisfactory to people, they might actually not have to invest so much in forcing it on people. They wanted to see the attitude of people in Eastern Europe toward communism evolve from one where they accepted it because they had to one where they found that they could accept it because they chose to. And they thought that maybe Imre Nagy's reforms might be a step toward that. So they let the Hungarians get away with this. But two things happened. Number one, many Hungarians took this opportunity. The fact that things had sort of liberalized and there was a little bit more freedom in Hungary, many people, Hungarians took this opportunity to flee, to escape from Hungary. They left. And a lot of the people who were leaving Hungary, it was kind of like Berlin. They were, some of the most people with specialized knowledge, specialized skills, couldn't afford that. But maybe more importantly, Imre Nagy maybe took it a step or two too far for the Soviets, because as the Soviets sort of allowed him to get away with his reforms, he then declared that Hungary was a neutral country, that Hungary was no longer going to be a member of the Warsaw Pact, right? The Warsaw Pact was that alliance, that military alliance that the Soviets had created, that Hungary would no longer be a member of the Warsaw Pact, and that Hungary would consider itself a neutral country in the Cold War. Neither a communist country, a reformed communist country, but neither on the side of the United States nor the Soviet Union. And that was a step too far for the Soviets. They were willing to accept a certain amount of reform, change, if it meant that communism would get a more human face. They were not prepared for Hungary to detach themselves from the Soviet bloc and call themselves neutral. So Soviet troops invaded Hungary. 200,000, or I don't know how many. I did the wrong number there. I'm thinking of a different invasion. Thousands of Soviet troops and tanks pushed into Budapest, the capital, in a show of armed force that was meant to intimidate Nagy and intimidate the Hungarians, but it didn't work. Instead, the Hungarians fought back. And what followed was about 6 weeks of fighting in the streets of Budapest for control of the city of Budapest. Hungarian fighters were, for the most part, civilians who had armed themselves with improvised weapons, Molotov cocktails, which you take an empty bottle of wine or an empty bottle of liquor, and you fill it with gasoline, and you stick a rag soaked in gasoline in the neck of the bottle, and you light the rag, and then you throw it, into a mass of Soviet troops. And when it hits the ground, it breaks, and the gasoline goes everywhere and ignites like that. Or you can even take out a Soviet tank with it, as these people have done. And so the fighting was extremely intense, and the outcome of it for some time was in doubt. Though ultimately, the Soviets did defeat the Hungarians, with thousands of people killed. Estimates on the number of people killed in Hungary range from 6,000 up to as many as 20,000. Probably 20,000 is a closer number. Um, so, in the end, the Soviets prevailed. They were able to bring enough armed force into the city of Budapest to defeat the civilian fighters of Hungary. Imre Nagy was captured and executed by the Soviets. And it went to show that the Soviets, again, they sort of had their version of containment. Um, the United States would provide assistance to governments that were threatened by being taken over by communism. The Soviets would use armed force to ensure that communist governments did not stray too far from the version of communism that the Soviets wanted. This also pointed out a real weakness of our version of containment, because we had said that we will not attack communism where it already exists. We will work actively to stop it from spreading. Since we viewed that as our policy, it prevented the United States from providing really any kind of assistance to the Hungarians. We had basically admitted that in Eastern Europe, the Soviets could kind of do what they wanted. In communist Europe, where communism already existed, the Soviets could kind of do what they wanted, and this meant that we stood by, while the Soviets crushed this revolt, this uprising in Hungary. We did accept thousands of Hungarian refugees into the United States, but that was about it. So it really did also point up the limitations of our own containment policy. In 1968, there was a second fairly major uprising, in a sense, against the traditional Soviet style of communism. This one took place in Czechoslovakia, in the capital city of Prague. So the capital of Hungary was Budapest, the capital of Czechoslovakia was Prague, Prague, as you see there at the top of the box, over on the right side of page 12. The story was basically the same. You've got communist leadership in Czechoslovakia admitting that the Czech people, given their choice, would not choose communism. Now, this is 1968. They've been communist for, by this time, 22 years, 21 years. And the leadership of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia was saying, yes, we remain communist, but it's only because we continue to force it on our people. We don't know how much longer our people will accept that. We need to reform communism. We need to make communism less oppressive. We need to make communism more satisfactory. And so Alexander Dubček, who was he was part of Czechoslovakia's Communist Party, like Imre Nagy. He was not looking to get rid of communism. He was a communist, but he was looking to make it more acceptable to the Czech people. And he did kind of the same stuff that Imre Nagy had done. He introduced freedom of speech and freedom of the press. He allowed for criticism of communism and of some of the policies of communism. He allowed for that criticism to be public. Because again, his attitude was, if the people don't choose it, do we really have a right to force it on them, right? So he allowed for that kind of open criticism. And during the spring of 1968, you get this real outpouring of expression and creativity, that's known as the Prague Spring. And again, it was very much young people not much older than you, university student types who were taking advantage of this of this opportunity to speak freely and write freely and act freely. Um, and so for a time, Czechoslovakia experienced a kind of freedom that that generation of people had never experienced before. But once again, the Soviets were alarmed by the direction that this could be going, and so this is the 200,000. And so they ordered 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops. So these were troops not only from the Soviet Union, but from other Warsaw Pact countries, Poland and East Germany, to invade Czechoslovakia. This time, Alexander Dubček, the leader of the reformers, he basically, knowing what had happened 12 years earlier in Hungary, he, in a message to the Czech people, basically told them to stand down, to not resist the Soviets, saying, look, if we fight, then the only result will be that thousands of us will die. This is overwhelming force that the Soviets are bringing. We know that they won't be merciful. We saw what they did in Budapest and Hungary. So stand down. We're not going to resist. We're not going to fight back against this. And so as a result, instead of thousands of people dying, just about 100 people in Czechoslovakia were killed who did not heed his warnings and did try to fight back against the Soviets. So there's no widespread uprising in Czechoslovakia the way that there was in Hungary. Dubček was not then executed the way that Imre Nagy was. He was, however, reassigned to the Forestry Bureau and sort of banished to a job out in the middle of nowhere. But shortly after that, the leader of the Soviet Union, whose name was Leonid Brezhnev, and that's a attractive guy, Brezhnev was now the leader of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, again, had died in 1953. He had been succeeded by a guy named Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev had been kicked out because of poor performance back in 1964. Now in 1968, the leader of the Soviet Union was Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev issued sort of his own doctrine. Now, remember that our President Truman had his Truman Doctrine, in which he said the United States would assist free countries that were in danger of being overthrown by communism. Brezhnev now issued his own doctrine, stating that communist countries, which were in danger of being overthrown by non-communist governments, which really in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, that wasn't happening. It was just communists with an eye toward reform. But he said communist countries which are in danger of becoming non-communist may require the assistance of the Soviet Union to remain communist. He said that it was in the interest of all communist countries to keep individual countries from falling from communism, so that if one country was threatened by not being communist anymore, all communist countries were threatened. So all communist countries had a right to intervene and get involved and prevent that from happening. So it was Brezhnev now sort of giving his own expression to the Soviets' version of containment. So it became very clear by the end of the 1960s that, just as the United States was determined to prevent free governments from falling to communism, the Soviets were equally determined to prevent communist governments, really even from straying from the version of communism that the Soviets believed in. They were even against reform, and that they were willing to use force to make that happen. And again, it pointed up the weakness of our own communist or our own containment policy, which was that, we basically agreed that they could do whatever they wanted in Eastern Europe, in communist Europe. There wasn't much that we could or would do to stop them from kind of having their way there. So that it seemed to mean that Europe was now kind of seemingly permanently divided into a part of Europe where communism would not be challenged, that is Eastern Europe, and a part of Europe where communism would not be allowed to rise, that is Western Europe. So the Cold War had settled into a kind of a stalemate in Europe. Well, that's as far as we're going to go with that. And for now, we're done with Europe. By now, we're now switching over to Asia and the emergence of communism in China and the eruption of the Cold War in China. We'll come back to Europe eventually and explain how it is that communism did come to an end there, but not for now. So until then, take care of yourselves, hang in there, and so long, modern world history students.